Imagine standing in Antarctica today. All around you, there is nothing but endless ice, frozen mountains, and freezing winds. It feels like a place where life should barely exist. But now, imagine something completely different. Imagine Antarctica covered in forests, trees stretching across the land, rivers flowing through green valleys, birds moving through the branches, and prehistoric animals walking beneath the ancient canopy. It sounds impossible, but millions of years ago, Antarctica really was a much warmer world. A world where forests could grow near the South Pole. A world where dinosaurs lived on land that is now buried beneath enormous layers of ice. So, how did a green continent become the frozen wilderness we know today? What happened to those forests? Where did all that ice come from? And could Antarctica ever become green again? To answer those questions, we have to travel back millions of years to a time when the world looked completely different. Today, Antarctica is the coldest continent on Earth. Its massive ice sheet covers almost the entire landmass. In some places, the ice is several kilometers thick. Underneath all of that frozen material is a landscape that most of us will never see. Mountains, valleys, ancient rock formations, and hidden beneath them, the remains of an ancient world. Because Antarctica was not always the frozen continent we know today. Long before the modern ice sheet existed, Antarctica was part of a very different Earth. It was connected to other southern continents as part of a massive landmass called Gondwana. At that time, the continents were positioned differently. South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica were connected in a vast southern supercontinent. The map of Earth would have looked almost unrecognizable. And Antarctica itself was not an isolated, frozen desert. It was home to vegetation. It had forests, it had rivers, and it supported animals. But there was something incredibly unusual about these ancient forests. Antarctica was already located close to the South Pole. That meant the forest had to deal with something most modern forests never experience: months of extreme darkness. During parts of the year, sunlight could disappear for long periods. Then, during the warmer season, daylight could last for incredibly long periods. For plants, this was a completely different way of life. They had to survive dramatic changes in light and temperature, and somehow they did. Ancient Antarctic forests included plants related to conifers and other prehistoric vegetation. These were not tropical rainforests in the way we might imagine them today, but they could still form dense green ecosystems. Trees grew, plants spread across the ground, and entire communities of organisms adapted to life at the edge of the world. The ability of these plants to survive such extreme seasonal conditions tells us something remarkable about life. Life does not always need perfect conditions. Sometimes it simply needs enough time to adapt. And Antarctica gave evolution millions of years to experiment. But plants were not the only inhabitants of this ancient continent. Dinosaurs lived here too. Yes, dinosaurs once walked across Antarctica. Of course, it did not look anything like the frozen landscape we see today. There were no endless glaciers covering the continent. Instead, there were forests and relatively mild environments compared with modern Antarctica. Dinosaurs had spread across much of the planet, and some species adapted to life in the extreme southern regions. Imagine walking through an Antarctic forest millions of years ago. You would see trees around you. You might hear the movement of animals somewhere in the vegetation. And beyond the forest, the landscape would stretch toward the southern polar region. The strange thing is that these animals were living through seasonal darkness. For months, the sun could become extremely limited, yet life continued. That is one of the most fascinating parts of Antarctica's ancient history. The continent was not simply warm. It was warm enough for complex ecosystems to exist despite its location near the pole. But Earth was changing, and the climate was changing with it. Over millions of years, continents slowly moved. Ocean currents changed, the atmosphere changed, and Antarctica gradually became more isolated from the warmer parts of the planet. One of the biggest transformations came as ocean circulation around Antarctica became stronger. Eventually, the Antarctic circumpolar current began circulating around the continent. This powerful ocean system helped isolate Antarctica from warmer waters coming from farther north. As Antarctica became increasingly isolated, its climate began to cool. The transition did not happen overnight, it was a slow transformation. Snow began accumulating. Year after year, more snow survived the warmer seasons. The pressure of new layers compressed the old ones. Snow became ice. Ice became thicker. And eventually, enormous glaciers began spreading across the landscape. The forest disappeared, rivers froze, vegetation collapsed, and slowly the green continent began turning white. Imagine that transformation happening over millions of years. A forest that once supported animals becomes colder. The seasons become harsher. Snow begins covering the ground, then more snow, then ice. Generation after generation, the landscape changes. Eventually, the world that once existed on the surface becomes buried beneath an enormous frozen layer. But nature leaves evidence behind. Even when an ecosystem disappears, traces of it can survive. Sometimes they are preserved in rocks. Sometimes they are found as fossils. Sometimes they appear as microscopic fragments of ancient plants. And sometimes, scientists discover pieces of ancient wood. These clues allow researchers to reconstruct Antarctica's forgotten past. They can determine what kinds of plants lived there. They can study the sediments where ancient ecosystems once existed. They can even use microscopic evidence to understand what the climate was like millions of years ago, and the story becomes clear. Antarctica was once significantly warmer than it is today. Its landscape supported forests, its ecosystem supported animals, and its climate was completely different from the frozen world we see now. But there is another reason Antarctica is so important. The ice itself contains a record of Earth's climate. Deep inside the ice are tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere. These bubbles can preserve samples of gases that existed thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Scientists can study these layers and learn about past atmospheric conditions. The ice becomes a kind of time capsule, a frozen archive of Earth's history. That means Antarctica is not simply a frozen continent. It is a record of the planet's past, a memory preserved beneath kilometers of ice. And that leads to an even more fascinating question. Could Antarctica ever become green again? The answer is complicated. Earth's climate has changed dramatically throughout its history. There have been periods when Antarctica was much warmer. There have also been periods when enormous ice sheets covered large parts of the planet. So, in the very long-term history of Earth, Antarctica becoming much warmer is not impossible. But that does not mean we should expect forests to appear there anytime soon. The Antarctic ice sheet is enormous. Transforming the continent from its current frozen state into a green landscape would require enormous and sustained changes to the global climate system. And if such a transformation happened, it would not only affect Antarctica. Global sea levels would change, ocean circulation would change, weather patterns would shift, and ecosystems around the world would be transformed. That is why the story of ancient Antarctica matters. It is not simply a story about dinosaurs or forgotten forests. It is a reminder that Earth's climate system is powerful enough to transform entire continents. The Antarctica we know today is only one chapter in a much longer story. Under the ice are mountains that have existed for millions of years. Under the sediments are traces of ecosystems that disappeared long before humans existed. And buried beneath the frozen surface is evidence of a world that once looked completely different. A world where forests grew near the South Pole, a world where dinosaurs walked through ancient vegetation, a world where life survived months of darkness, and eventually a world where the climate changed so dramatically that almost everything on the surface disappeared beneath ice. Today, Antarctica looks almost lifeless from a distance. White plains stretch toward the horizon. Massive glaciers slowly move through valleys. The wind sweeps across frozen landscapes, and for much of the year, darkness dominates the southernmost parts of the planet. But beneath that silence is a story millions of years old. A story written in fossils, written in rocks, written in layers of ice, and written in the tiny remains of plants that once grew beneath an Antarctic sky. The next time you see an image of Antarctica, remember that you are not looking at a continent that has always been frozen. You're looking at the remains of a world that changed. A world where ice replaced forests, where glaciers replaced rivers, and where one of the greenest chapters of Earth's ancient history eventually disappeared beneath a frozen ocean of ice. Antarctica is frozen today, but it was not always this way. Before the glaciers, before the endless white landscape, before the silence, there were forests. And millions of years ago, in a world almost impossible for us to imagine, Antarctica was green.